Welcome. So glad you can be with us. We're all gathered here for the same purpose. We all want the world to come to peace and freedom. Each one of us wants to wake up. We all want the truth. And that's why we're here. So what brings us here is this pandemic. And I'd like to start by dealing with the pandemic on a personal level. Gangaji and I have been cocooning, I call it. I forget what the official name is. We've been doing it now for our second week. Although it wasn't official, it wasn't the rule. We did it out of solidarity with our community, which for me is a very different experience. I've always been one to break the rules. I've been the one to ignore the community. I've gone at odds with the community. But it feels so good to be doing this in solidarity with the community, whether it's required at this moment or not, although pretty soon I'm sure it will be. And part of that, part of this cocooning that we're in, is I've had to learn to wash my hands. And that may be true for a bunch of you out there. I know for me, I lived for years without running water. So washing my hands was not a high priority. I lived in a tree for a while. I lived in 6 months in Peru where there was no running water. So I never really learned to, I washed my hands after, I came out of the toilet, but nothing beyond that. And so I've learned to wash my hands. And in washing my hands, it reminds me of a story I heard years ago about Dr. Semmelweis. Dr. Semmelweis was a Buddhist physician practicing in Vienna in the 1800s. And he saw that these surgeons were coming out of their surgeries after being with corpses and doing deliveries, and the babies were dying at an alarming rate. And he couldn't figure out why. And he saw another part of the clinic where only midwives were being trained, and they didn't have the death rate that the doctors did because they weren't doing surgeries. Well, that's the conclusion he came to, but he had to eliminate everything else. What could it possibly be? He looked at their religion. He looked at their class. He looked at the patient density. He looked at everything he could. And the only thing he saw that made a difference was that the doctors were coming out of the surgeries. And he had an insight. This insight was, he said, there are cadaverous particles traveling with the doctors to the obstetrics ward. And if only they would wash their hands, it would save lives. And he practiced this. He put this into place with his midwives and with other people, and it worked. But the doctors, the surgeons, were outraged that this man thought that there were these invisible things that were happening that were somehow connected to them and that they were killing their babies. They couldn't take it. This is before the germ theory started. The germ theory comes out of this. We now know that there are invisible little beings jumping from one hand to another without our being able to see it. But those days, in the 1800s, this was heresy. And this doctor was stripped of his ability to make a living. He had a mental breakdown. He was then forcibly incarcerated in a mental institution where he was beaten to death within a week of his admittance. Dr. Semmelweis, the pioneer of washing your hands. So we all owe a debt of gratitude to the dead Dr. Semmelweis. He also gave rise to this phrase, Semmelweis, where you're presented with new information, but you can't accept it because it flies in the face of your held beliefs. So, how useful is that? So here we are in a pandemic. And I wrote notes down. The first time I heard the word pandemic, I was in a commune in LA, and I'd been sent from my commune, this is 1974, I'd been sent from my commune to one of the first Earth Days. And at this Earth Day, which was a gathering of the tribes, all the different communes and communities, and the ecological communities, the farming communities, all came together. And one of the speeches I heard, this was 1974, so he said, or 73, he said, you know, the ecological imbalance is going to cause the ice to melt. It's going to cause catastrophic storms. It's going to cause fresh water shortages, and it's going to cause pandemics. First time I ever heard the word used. And I knew it was true, but I just assumed it would never happen in my lifetime. And so now here we are. And it's good news and it's bad news. And the title of this talk was Sacred Shattering, which I thought was a brilliant title that Jared and Lisa, I believe, came up with. And I'd like to address this from the pandemic level, from the shattering level, and from the sacred level. On the pandemic level, I've seen so many different streams of advice. How to deal with your fear, how to stay calm, how to breathe. I saw one with different fixations, and what each fixation can do to stay calm and relaxed in the midst of this. Now, it's true, this is a life-threatening moment, and in a life-threatening moment, fear arises for some people, naturally. But if that fear then is calmed down, you take a tranquilizer, you mellow out, you drink some wine, you play some music, you do some deep breathing, you do some pranayama, you do some yoga, then you've misused the opportunity of fear. So there are going to be good news and bad news associated with this pandemic. And I want to look at it from all sides. So the first side is about advice. Yes, it's helpful if you're terrified and you don't know about pranayama. Do some deep breathing. It will definitely help. There are all sorts of things to calm you down, if that's what you want. But if you're on this call, I suspect what you want is something deeper, to be able to use this well. Because you know, in our lifetime, we get very few opportunities where there is a sacred shattering. And in those opportunities of sacred shattering, when time stands still, when the world as we know it stops, the best of us and the worst of us come to the surface. And that's our opportunity to use it well. One of the ways it's used well is that in this shattering, when time stands still, when everything that was normal is now not normal, in this release, there's this potential for true humanity. I first experienced this in Montgomery, Alabama in 1965, as I'm sure most of you have heard too many times. But as an 18-year-old white boy from New York, to come into a war zone where the Ku Klux Klan was riding up on people's houses at night, the police had both ends of the street closed off. I was sleeping on the floor of the Jackson Street Baptist Church, and the community was alive and connected. Strangers met each other on the street. People who we didn't know took us in. Everyone was caring for everyone else. I was 18 years old, it was 1965, and that permanently marked my life with the possibility of how we can relate with each other. Unfortunately, it only seems to happen in times of cataclysm. I've experienced it not only with cataclysm, I'm sorry, let me take it back. You can have, if you're a part of a sports team, or you're part of a combat group, or you're part of any other group that is specialized, connected, and interdependent, you get these bonds that can last for a lifetime. You get these truths that can open to each other. You get a camaraderie that can't be experienced by the normal world. And so generally it's reserved for those who leave the normal world. When I was in New York after 9/11, it was another one of those moments where everyone was blown open. I've never Growing up in New York, I'd never seen anything like this. People were taking each other in off the street. They were feeding each other. They were caring for each other. They were open with each other in a way I'd never seen. And it showed me the possibility of what it is to be a human. And of course, the next day, our president said, go back to shopping. And he started his Holy Crusade, which basically led us here. So if you look at this in a historical context, this shattering, this stopping, if you look at it historically, you have to look at it politically as well. And when I said the best of us arise and the worst of us arise, you can see that our president, last couple days I noticed that the Heritage Foundation, which is the right-wing group that has put in Kavanaugh and changed the agenda of the United States, has started putting out that Trump has overreacted, that in fact, it's not good to destroy the economy to save lives. You know, it'll pass, it's just a flu. And so these are the first splits of our society between the humanists and the ones that say money is more important than human life. And that split is what's broken us apart and opens up the possibility for something new. And you know, Trump is just the last in the line. You can't blame Trump. There wouldn't have been a Trump if there wasn't a George W. Bush. We thought George W. Bush was the worst president in the history of the country. Who knew someone could come along even worse? And before George W. Bush, we had Ronald Reagan, who destroyed our social fabric. And before Ronald Reagan, we had Nixon. And you just look down the line. Nixon was nowhere near as bad as Reagan. And Reagan is a saint compared to George W. Bush. And George W. Bush is a genius compared to the madman who's destroyed our republic. So for me, this particular time of pandemic comes as we lost our republic. When the conviction of the sitting president for obvious crimes and misdemeanors is whitewashed, we no longer have a constitution, a functioning constitution. We're living in a new world of oligarchy. And this fall itself, if you look at it, it really starts with the peak of the American Empire. The peak of the American Empire was November 1963, when John Kennedy was president. Everyone loved America. Even the communists who hated America wanted to be American. America was the possibility. It was the living torch of freedom on the hill. It may not have been true. Certainly, it was already in Vietnam. But at some fundamental level, it was the collective story. And when he was assassinated, when Kennedy was assassinated, it shattered the story of America. It set up competing stories. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the reaction to that split this country apart. And I've got to say, I was part of that. I disrespected the government. And that leads you to Trump. At the time, what else could we do? We disrespected the government because the government was committing a genocidal war and lying to us. And so I became a revolutionary. And that helped shatter the social fabric of a common story. And then it gets picked up by the counter-revolutionaries, by the right wing, by the paranoid projectionists who see fantasies of conspiracies everywhere. But you have to start with the Kennedy assassination, which was the first conspiracy that this nation had to face. And then it goes off into paranoid projections. And so we see how even what seemed right at the time has consequences that we have no idea about. And so we can't judge. We can't blame. But the more clearly we see things, the better our perspective, the more equanimity we can bring to the situation. As for the shattering that I put with Kennedy, It goes before that. World War I brought about Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. He rearranged the understanding of societies. Instead of seeing them linearly, he saw them organically. He saw that they can start as a small culture, grow into a society, develop into a civilization, grow into an empire, and then collapse. And he saw we were at the end of the age of empires. It was collapsing. It's the 1920s. And one of my teachers was Joseph Campbell, whose book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, one of the most important books of my life at that time. I was in a retreat with Joseph Campbell back in the 80s, and he had told me that in college, he and all his friends, they were in this bright Ivy League schools, were reading The Decline of the West, and they thought, they know it's true, they can feel it coming, but how can they stop it? What can they do? And so Joseph Campbell, this enlightened, beautiful, warm-hearted, brilliant man who integrates mythologies from all world religions to show there's a common unity and thread, supports Ronald Reagan because he saw the hippies as the barbarians at the gate that were going to destroy the West because he had the Roman Vandals in mind. And so if you look at it in that context, we can see, yes, the United States empire is over. It's collapsing. We can see China is on the rise. And in that context, with the environmental degradation, we have the start of pandemics. So where does that leave us? That leaves us, well, before we leave that, one last thing on Spengler's Decline of the West. It kind of sums it all up for me is this poem by Yeats, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, written around the same time. I'm just going to read part of it. It's called The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed on the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. That's the shattering. That's where we are in the shattering. Now, what makes it sacred? For the first time, almost every country on all continents are consciously connected in a world event. We're all in this together. Just as the pandemic is only the first, the interconnectedness of our human family will also grow and evolve as it spreads through the gene pool. We watch this dawning of this new time as the ice melts, the storms catastrophic, the forest fires burning around the globe. Largely, we watched it as spectators. But now, we're in it together. And in it together means on the personal, there are tests. When the ordinary existence is stopped in its tracks, the best and the worst rise up. This is the test of the field of character. Testing. Who do you serve? What do you serve? This is the test we've all been waiting for. The test we've all been waiting for. When we're in satsang or in a meeting, when we're singing, when we're joyful, when we're happy, when the world's at peace and there's no problem. And when hard times hit, bad times hit, then we start to frantically grasp at straws to try to save us. But rarely do we face a time when we're tested. What do you stand for? Of course, there's a fear of dying that naturally arises in everyone. But the question is, will that fear of dying save you from dying? If it will, beautiful. If it won't, maybe you can use it. You can use it to discover the fear of the death of individuality, the death of me and my life, which is terrifying. But in its discovery, in the willingness to examine who's afraid, you can find what's deeper. You can find who you are. And when you find what's deeper and you find who you are, this is not a magic pill. This doesn't mean, oh, now your body's not going to get sick. It doesn't mean, oh, now the pandemic doesn't mean anything. It's not real. It's only an illusion. It's never happened. It's not that. Because part of the solutions that people offer are these category jumps that aren't accurate. People say, oh, where's the perfection? This is perfect as it is. This is the perfect expression of where we are in this moment. Nothing needs to change. We don't need to make it perfect. We don't need to change the imperfections. But we can face ourselves to see what are we using as a way of buffering against what's happening in this moment in this world. If we unbuffer ourselves, if we peel back all the spiritual platitudes that we use to keep ourselves calm, if you become nakedly exposed to yourself, then it's actually worthwhile. Something good has come, something meaningful. So use this time of retreat well. Now, I know it's terrifying we're going to lose our money. Leela Foundation could go under. We're going to lose our income. We could lose our lives. Everyone is potentially going to be infected and die. You can imagine all the worst case scenarios and scare yourself and depress yourself and make yourself miserable. Or you can ignore them and go into a nihilistic bliss. If it doesn't matter, we're all going to die anyway, let's just go out and party. Or you can actually discover the joy in living in this moment of inquiry. If you're all alone in an apartment in New York somewhere, you can't get out. It can be stultifying. But for that, I have an antidote. This is a well-used book, as you can see. I started taking this book with me to Ashland for my first retreats in the 1980s to read this poem to you. And this is from St. John of the Cross. St. John of the Cross, Catholic priest, being tortured in the monastery during the Inquisition. I believe he was a converso, which means he converted to Catholicism. And now his faith is being tested. He's being kept in a cage while the monks eat. He's thrown into isolation in a dark dungeon. And he writes this poem. In the midst of persecution, starvation, abuse, abandonment, living in a dark cage alone, he writes this poem. I entered into unknowing, and there I remained unknowing, transcending all knowledge. I entered into unknowing, and yet when I saw myself there, without knowing where I was, I understood great things. I did not say what I felt. I cannot say what I felt, for I remained in unknowing, transcending all knowledge. That perfect knowledge was of peace and holiness, held at no remove. In profound solitude, it was something so secret that I was left stammering, transcending all knowledge. I was so overwhelmed, so absorbed and withdrawn, that my senses were left deprived of their sensing, and my spirit was given an understanding while not understanding, transcending all knowledge. Whoever truly arrives here cuts free from himself, and all that you knew before now seems worthless. And your knowledge so soars that you are left in unknowing, transcending all knowledge. And the higher you ascend, the less you understand, because the cloud is dark, which lit up the night. Whoever knows this remains always in unknowing, transcending all knowledge. This knowledge in unknowing is so overwhelming that wise men disputing can never overthrow it, for their knowledge doesn't reach to the understanding of non-understanding, transcending all knowledge. And the supreme knowledge is so exalted that no power of man or learning can grasp it. But whoever masters himself will, with knowledge in unknowing, always be transcending. And if you should want to hear, the highest knowledge lies in the loftiest sense of the essence of God. This is a work of His mercy to leave one without understanding, transcending all knowledge. Okay. From St. John of the Cross at the time of total madness. So if it's possible for you to use this time well, to cocoon, to face whatever needs to be faced, to question yourself so deeply, and to listen so deeply to the truth, that this cocooning gives rise to a new form of life that flies out into the boundarylessness that was glimpsed through the stopping of the world. Now, as I said, I've seen lots of advice about how to cope with this. And one of the things I saw on the Facebook feed was, if you can't go outside, go inside. Now, that's absolutely good and right. But what weight does it have? Probably most people here saw something just like it. If you can't go outside, go inside. Some other beautiful little phrase that tells the truth, but has no weight. The only way it has weight is if it comes from something deeper than the conceptual mind. When I met my teacher, he didn't tell me anything new. He never spoke any words that I didn't already understand. It was a living transmission of silence. This is what we're all hungry for. This is what is possible for you in this moment of pandemic, of shattering, is to make the shattering sacred. And you make the shattering sacred simply by listening so deeply that the cliches and the surface truths don't touch you. Because something fundamental is awakening. Yeats didn't know what it was. He saw something slouching towards Bethlehem to be born in his way. But it's not that. There's nothing slouching. And there is no Bethlehem. It's where you are in this moment. People all over the world are giving their lives to waking up. This is unprecedented. Usually it's just one. You know, there's Buddha, there's this St. John of the Cross. You see one of how many generations? And now, all over the world, we have a community of awakening. Different paths, different levels, different depths. Some dead ends, some true paths. But so many people are now dedicating their lives to something beyond just me and mine. And it's beautiful. I watch people in our community over the years try to look for a safe space to live. These are people who have enough money to live wherever they want, and they buy houses wherever they want, and they're looking for the safe place that they can live, where they will, when the downfall happens, they will be okay. If these people just put the money they spent on those extra houses into stopping the environmental disaster, into serving the people who are already hurting, so that we all have our choices. How will we spend our time? What will we do? You know, our thoughts are not going to change it. I mean, we do the best we can do with what we have. But the only way you can do the best that you can do with what you have is if you're willing to go all the way in, to expose everything to yourself, to tell the truth to yourself on the deepest level, to where there's no separation between me and it. There's no me and my higher self. There's no me and God. There's no me and oneness. That distinction disappears when you go so deeply into yourself that there's no in or out. Then, that's the possibility that spreads from heart to heart. That's what we're all hungry for. And so in that, let's all of us for a moment, let's just take a moment to just let everything relax. A little guided meditation, if you will. And you might want to start by just noticing your body's breathing. And in noticing your body's breathing, something deeper releases. And the breathing changes without you doing anything at all. And as you find yourself settling down into a deeper layer, it can feel so deeply good to let everything go. That everything you've been holding, the good, the bad, the unconscious, the conscious, the desires, the fears, the thoughts, the feelings, open. And as it opens, you fall down into the next layer of your own self. And it can feel so good to fall so deeply in that you can discover vast spaciousness in all directions. And as you realize this spaciousness above you, in front of you, behind you, below you, for a moment discover, is there any separation between you and this spaciousness? That's very good. And from here you can really ask yourself, what do I really want in the deepest level? And listen so deeply. The answer doesn't come necessarily as a thought or a voice or a picture, but of a sense of knowing that is solid and unchanging. And what if the answer and the question both dissolve in this moment? And then you can see, what am I living for? What's the point? What's the purpose of my life? It's very good. Really beautiful. I'm so glad we get to connect like this. So we'll discover when waking consciousness reappears as if you are somebody inside a body. That itself is just a bubble that arises and falls, appears, disappears. So the bubble of me can be here now and discover what it feels like in the bubble of me. And the bubble of me can disappear. And what's the experience when the bubble of me disappears? It's very good. Now, is it possible that even as the bubble of me reappears, you stay grounded in the truth of yourself that includes everything? Bubbles, waves, tornadoes, and plagues included. It's very good. So when you're ready, you can return to body consciousness and body awareness. So thank you for being here. I look forward to our meeting like this again. And may all beings be happy and free.